Malcolm had just pulled into his driveway when he noticed something was terribly wrong. The air smelled of smoke, thick and acrid, curling into his nostrils before he even stepped out of his car. His chest tightened. This wasn't the usual scent of a neighbor's barbecue or someone burning leaves. This was sharper, more urgent. A kind of scent that sent a primal warning straight to his gut. His eyes swept over his house, and that's when he saw it. Flames, small but growing, flickering orange and angry against the night, dancing along the base of his front porch. His heartbeat surged, pounding against his ribs. His first instinct was to rush forward, to stomp it out, to do something, until his gaze caught movement just beyond the flames. A woman. Blonde, mid-40s, standing there as if she were surveying her work. Her fingers tightened around a red gas can, the plastic glinting beneath the streetlights. Malcolm froze. His mind struggled to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. Who was she? Why was she? What the hell are you doing? His voice came out sharper than he intended, but the sheer insanity of the situation had snapped his composure. The woman flinched, spinning toward him, her blue eyes wide with shock. No, not shock. Fear. Not the kind of fear you'd expect from someone caught committing arson, but something else. Something performative. Malcolm barely had time to process before she reached into her oversized purse, fumbling wildly before yanking out her phone. "Oh my God," she shrieked, stumbling backward. "Help! A black man is attacking me!" Malcolm's stomach twisted. This wasn't happening. He took a step forward, instinctively raising his hands. "Lady, are you serious right now?" The phone was pressed to her ear. "Yes! Send the police! He's trying to kill me!" she gasped, as if imagining an attack that hadn't even happened. Malcolm's pulse slammed against his skull. This was bad. The fire, the gas can, the way she was twisting the scene, the way the world would see this when the police arrived. He knew how this played out. His voice dropped, forcing himself to stay calm. "Put the phone down." She only screamed louder. "Please hurry. He's huge. He's coming right at me." Malcolm clenched his fists at his sides, resisting the urge to curse, to shout, to demand she stop lying. It wouldn't help. His mother had drilled it into him since childhood. Stay calm, stay still, don't give them an excuse. But the fire was growing. His house, his memories, his life. A flicker of movement caught his eye. The street. A neighbor's porch light had turned on. Someone was watching. Good. That might be the only thing that saved him. Sirens wailed in the distance. They were coming. Malcolm's mind raced as the sirens grew louder, their piercing wails slicing through the night. His body was frozen between two impossible choices: run or stand his ground. Running would make him look guilty. Staying meant gambling on whether the cops would believe his side of the story. The woman clutched her phone like a lifeline, still sobbing into it. "Oh my God, I think he has a weapon. Please, please hurry." Malcolm clenched his jaw, inhaling sharply to steady himself. His hands remained in plain sight, fingers spread wide. His every movement felt like it was being recorded in the air, every twitch a potential threat in the eyes of whoever showed up. Then came the tires screeching against pavement. Red and blue lights painted the street in violent bursts. A squad car swerved to a stop in front of the house. The second it did, 2 officers leaped out, guns already drawn. "Get on the ground! Hands where we can see them!" Malcolm didn't move at first. It wasn't defiance, just the crushing weight of disbelief. His house was burning. His life was in danger. And yet, he was the one being treated like the criminal. "Down on the ground, now!" one of the officers barked, stepping forward aggressively. Malcolm exhaled slowly, forcing his knees to bend. "I live here," he said, his voice careful, controlled. "That woman, shut up! Hands behind your head!" His teeth pressed together so tightly his jaw ached. Still, he complied, lowering himself onto the cold concrete. His heart pounded as one officer roughly grabbed his wrists, wrenching them back. Metal bit into his skin as cuffs snapped around them. "Please, you have to listen." Malcolm tried again, but his voice was drowned out by the woman's wailing. "He chased me. He was trying to kill me. I thought I was going to die." She sobbed, hugging herself like she was the one in danger. One officer knelt beside Malcolm, frisking him while the other approached the woman. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I saw him breaking in," she hiccuped. "I think he was trying to rob the place." A bitter laugh almost slipped past Malcolm's lips. "Rob? His own house?" The officer gripping his shoulder gave him a sharp shove. You think this is funny? Malcolm sucked in a breath, shaking his head. No. What's funny is that I own this house. His voice was laced with the frustration he was trying desperately to contain. Check my wallet, my ID. My name is Malcolm Carter. I live here. The officer hesitated. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. The other cop turned toward the woman. Ma'am, do you know him? She sniffled, wiping at dry eyes. No, I just assumed. Malcolm lifted his head slightly. You assumed because I'm black. Her lips parted, her expression momentarily unreadable, but then she shook her head, playing the victim again. I don't know, I was just scared. The flames crackled behind them, climbing higher, and finally, one of the officers noticed. Shit! Fire department's gonna need to get in here. The officer closest to Malcolm's cuffs hesitated again, and that's when Malcolm said the words that changed everything. Check the security cameras. The second Malcolm said it, the entire energy shifted. For the first time, real hesitation flickered in the officer's face. He turned to his partner, who glanced at the house, at the flames still climbing hungrily up the wooden panels, at the thick, dark smoke beginning to billow into the night sky. The fire department would be here soon, but the damage was already done. Malcolm could feel the heat from the fire warming his skin, the smell of burning wood thick in his nose, but he stayed completely still. The cuffs dug into his wrists, biting into his skin with every slight movement. He kept his breathing steady, kept his anger in check. He knew what happened to black men who lost their tempers at times like these. The officer who had cuffed him took a step back. His expression was unreadable beneath the flashing red and blue lights. Security cameras? Malcolm nodded once. Yes, I have cameras all over this house, front porch, driveway, even inside. If you check them, you'll see exactly what happened. For the first time, Karen's face twitched with something other than fake fear. It was brief, but Malcolm saw it, the momentary flicker of panic before she forced it back under control. She wrapped her arms around herself, shaking her head. I don't know what he's talking about. He's lying. Malcolm scoffed. Then check. One officer looked at the other, and there was a brief, silent exchange before the cop closest to Karen nodded toward the house. Do you know where the footage is stored? Malcolm's jaw tightened. Yes, it's backed up to the cloud, but there's a monitor in my living room. Karen's entire body stiffened. You're going to believe him over me, she shrieked. The officer didn't answer her. Instead, he reached for his radio. Dispatch, we need a fire unit out here ASAP. House is actively burning. A pause. And get someone to pull security footage from this address. Karen took a step back. Her face twisted in an expression Malcolm recognized too well, one of a person whose lie was beginning to unravel. I don't feel safe here. I need to leave. The officer turned to her sharply. You're not going anywhere. Her face paled. Malcolm almost smiled. Almost. The fire truck arrived then, sirens blaring, and firefighters jumped into action, rushing toward the house with hoses and gear. Water shot out in a powerful stream, hammering the flames as they hissed and curled. The fire was still spreading, but they were working fast to get it under control. Malcolm kept his focus on Karen. She was unraveling by the second, her hands trembling, her breathing shallow. And then, as if she could feel his eyes on her, she snapped. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. This isn't my fault. You thought I didn't belong here. His words cut through the air like a blade. She flinched. One of the officers was already speaking into his radio, requesting the footage. And Malcolm? He stayed silent, watching as Karen Whitmore's carefully built lie began to collapse all around her. The fire was finally under control, but Malcolm's house, his home, was scarred. Smoke curled from the charred remains of his front porch, and blackened wood stood as a testament to the destruction that could have been so much worse. Firefighters were still moving around, assessing the damage, but Malcolm barely heard them. His focus was locked on Karen. She was no longer playing the victim. Her face had lost its dramatic distress, replaced instead with something cold, something calculating. She was realizing, too late, that the game had changed. The tears had dried up, and in their place, a desperate kind of anger settled into her expression. She knew the truth was about to come out. The officers had made no move to uncuff Malcolm yet, but at least they weren't treating him like a criminal anymore. One of them had stepped away, talking into his radio, likely coordinating with whoever was pulling the security footage. The other officer, the one who had been rough with Malcolm before, seemed noticeably more subdued now. Malcolm exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. The night had already taken so much from him, his peace, his home, his dignity, but he wasn't about to lose control. Not now. Karen suddenly turned toward the nearest officer, her voice urgent. "You don't actually believe him, do you? I mean, come on, these people always have cameras." She cut herself off too late. Silence fell over the small crowd of firefighters, police officers, and onlookers who had gathered nearby. Malcolm let out a low chuckle. "These people, huh?" The officer nearest to her frowned. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to stop talking." But Karen had already backed herself into a corner. Her mask was slipping, and she knew it. Her breaths were short and sharp, her hands twitching at her sides. Malcolm, still on his knees, shifted slightly. "You broke into my property," he said, his voice even. "You set fire to my house. Then, when I caught you, you called the cops and told them I was the threat." Karen scoffed. "That's not. I was trying to protect the neighborhood. This house has been suspicious for months. There are strange people coming and going at all hours." Malcolm's eyebrows shot up. "You mean me? Coming and going from my house?" Her lips pressed together. One of the officers cleared his throat. "I think it's best we wait for the footage before anyone says anything else." Karen folded her arms, her lips twisting into something bitter. "I know what this is. You're all afraid of being called racist, so now you're siding with him." Malcolm let out a slow breath. "No, they're siding with facts." As if on cue, the officer who had stepped away returned, his phone in hand. His face was unreadable, but Malcolm saw the tension in his shoulders. "We got the footage." Karen stiffened. "And?" The officer didn't look at her. Instead, he turned to his partner and gave a small nod. "Take the cuffs off him." Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over him as he felt the cold metal unclasp from his wrists. Karen took a step forward, her voice rising in panic. "Wait, this is a mistake." The officer cut her off. "Ma'am, put your hands behind your back." Karen's mouth dropped open, her confidence shattering in an instant. "What? No, this is insane. I called you. I'm the victim." The officer's voice remained firm. "We just watched the footage. You trespassed, vandalized, and committed arson. You also knowingly filed a false police report." Malcolm rubbed his wrists, watching as Karen stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." But it didn't matter anymore, because the truth had finally caught up with her. Karen's panic shifted into something wild, almost animalistic, as the officer stepped toward her. "No, you don't understand. I was scared," she shrieked, her voice cracking. Her hands flailed, grasping at some unseen excuse, some last-minute justification that would make all of this go away. But it wasn't working. The officer remained unmoved. "Ma'am, hands behind your back. Now." Her breaths came in short, rapid bursts, her entire body shaking. She turned to the small crowd that had gathered. Neighbors standing on their porches, firefighters pausing their work, police officers watching in silence. Their faces were unreadable, but none of them looked like they were coming to her defense. She turned to Malcolm next, her blue eyes wide and desperate. "Please," she begged, her voice taking on a pleading edge. "I made a mistake. I just thought you had to be doing something illegal. I was only trying to protect my community." Malcolm let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Protect it from what? Me?" His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was just tired. Karen swallowed hard. "Aye," but there was nothing left to say. The officer reached for her arm, and the moment his hand touched her wrist, she shrieked. "No, you can't do this to me. I'm not a criminal." Malcolm watched, his face unreadable, as she thrashed wildly, her expensive designer heels scraping against the pavement. Her perfectly curated world was collapsing, and she didn't know how to handle it. "I was the victim," she sobbed as the officer forced her arms behind her back. The click of the handcuffs echoed in the air. Malcolm resisted the urge to laugh at the cruel irony of it. Those same cuffs had been around his wrists only minutes ago. Another officer stepped up. "We'll need to take her in for questioning." Karen whipped her head around. "Wait, questioning? But I called you!" Her voice was shrill, breaking apart. "This isn't fair. I have rights." "So does he." the officer said simply, nodding toward Malcolm. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time that night, she had no words. Malcolm let out a slow exhale as the reality of everything finally settled in. His house was damaged, his peace shattered, and the night had turned into something he never could have imagined. But at least, the truth had been exposed. As the officers led Karen toward the squad car, she kept turning her head, looking for someone to save her. But no one did. A few neighbors whispered among themselves. Some pulled out their phones, recording the woman who had once been so sure of her own innocence. The same neighbors who had probably watched her burn his house, who had heard her false accusations, but had stayed silent. Malcolm didn't know how to feel about that. As she was lowered into the back of the police car, Karen's voice wavered. This isn't over. Malcolm locked eyes with her through the window. His expression was calm, steady. Yes, it is, he said simply. The door shut. The car pulled away. And just like that, Karen Whitmore was gone.